Matthias Fitzpatrick. I'm a professor at Dartmouth in the Thayer School of Engineering, and this is our first podcast episode. And I have my good friend and former collaborator Alicia Kollár with us today. So we both have fun backgrounds for the YouTube channel, but this is just an audio podcast. So essentially, it's just a quick background on why we're doing this podcast, because every time I'm like, oh, I want to start a podcast, I tend to get weird looks from people because there are a lot of podcasts. So the question is, what is different about this one? And the answer to that is that in my work now as a professor, I see that a lot of students that are doing research for the first time, they kind of don't really know that a lot of the scientific process that's happening doesn't get talked about in papers and talks by experts in the field. And so when they're actually doing the science themselves, they'll hit roadblocks that are incredibly common, although they're always nuanced and different for each project. But they hit these roadblocks, and without a context for understanding that that is incredibly common and normal, I think it can be intimidating and lead people to think that they're not suited for science. So that's kind of the high level picture of why we're doing this. And so each episode, we're going to talk to a different expert. Today, this is a special treat because Alicia and I work together on this project. So we'll be talking later on in the episode about the paper that Alicia wrote and I worked with her on, which is hyperbolic lattices and circuit quantum electrodynamics, which is published in Nature in, what's the year? 2019. Oh, 4th of July, 2019. So yeah, without further ado, Alicia, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and like what led you to become a scientist and professor?
Well, hello everyone. As Matthias said, I'm Alicia. Um, how did I become a scientist? Well,
Very
my my
open-ended.
yeah, very open-ended question. Um, you know, I think I come from a family that thinks that people should either be world-class musicians or engineers. Um, and then there were a few rebels in the family who became, like doctors and math professors and stuff. And so that's sort of where I came from, that doing math or science was pretty normal. My dad is very, very good at math, and I had zero interest in competitive math competitions or anything like that in high school. Um, and so I think that basically what I ended up discovering is that I like tinkering with stuff and I like building stuff and I like thinking about logical problems. Why does this work? What makes this break? How can I get this piece of equipment to do something it was never meant to do? And I sort of discovered that physics did all that for me. And
Specifically experimental physics, right?
specifically, and so I didn't figure this out until well through grad school or undergrad, but the first signs I think of how much I would like being an experimental physicist came from middle camp with the middle school shop teacher where we built like bottle rockets and CO2 canister powered cars. And I liked really building the things.
Hmm.
And then I did, set construction in high school for the plays and musicals, and I really liked that too. And and then at the same time, I took high school physics from the teacher who was either the first or second most hated teacher in the high school, because he was a grumpy old dude who did not suffer fools. Um, and so if you slept in the back of his class, he was going to embarrass you about it.
Oof.
And if you acted like you were too cool for school, he was going to ask you a question you couldn't answer. Uh, you know, but
Old school.
old school. Like he also never, ever, ever picked on somebody that was working hard and trying to learn it and not necessarily succeeding. So it was yeah, I got this. That person had a target on their back. Somebody that was just trying to do it was fine. Um, And we were very, very good friends. It turned out we had the same sense of humor, you know, Far Side cartoons and Renaissance music. So it felt like my kind of people.
Mhm.
Um, and so then I went off to college, um, and I had only taken actually 1 year of physics in high school. So no AP physics in high school. Took AP chemistry and math instead. So I'd only had 1 year of physics. And so I went off to college thinking, well, maybe I'll do math because what other default was I going to have with two math professors for parents? And maybe I'll do physics. And sort of the more I did physics, the more I liked it. Um,
But Princeton's not an easy place to just jump into physics. So, what was that transition like from high school to college?
uh, it was a little shocking, I have to say. So the way they did this, the freshman mechanics course, there was a sort of honors version and a regular version. And what they did was they ran them together for the first 2 or 3 weeks
Mhm.
and had extra homework for the honors. And then if you wanted to do the honors one, they would talk to you.
Mhm.
And I kind of went through high school just like doing my homework as fast as I can. Okay, I'm done. And as sloppy as that implies,
Mhm.
right? Uh, And so then I did the honors homework and I got everything like half wrong. And
Mhm.
so then the professor sort of recommended that I not do the honors one. And I was
Mhm.
sort of shocked. And I was like, I can do better than this. I can pay more attention. And
Mhm.
he said, yeah, sure, which
Mhm.
is what the usual answer would be. But in the end, I managed it. And
Mhm.
so, and I eventually learned that like a lot of why I wasn't paying attention in high school was boredom.
Mhm.
And that I am not the kind of person that likes to pay attention to details. I will only pay attention to them if they are needed for a goal that I think matters.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I cannot care less about factors of two, minus signs, pi, like whatever.
Yep.
Which is not a great way to ace high school math
Well,
or physics.
I think this is definitely going to come back later when we talk about this project, right? And I think one of the things that you and I resonated with is that same philosophy about um, sort of what are the key ideas here, and yeah, factors of 2 pi, minus signs. Those things are sort of small details. Um,
Yeah, and
Tends to get
I
me into
think
trouble as a professor though, because I tend to hand wave and say, "Oh, well, that's not important. The big thing is this piece." Some of my students say,
yeah,
"Well, what is correct actually?" So I have to be
yeah,
careful as a professor doing that.
and I've learned to track it down eventually. But I think
Yeah.
that I mean, one of the things that we really see is that middle school and high school, and often a significant part of college, are
Mm-hmm.
really, they're trying to drill, we taught you a method, reproduce it exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm a musician, and so I call it call and response physics,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like you say the first word and then the student completes the
Yeah.
problem.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of the way to get an A is to be really good at that pattern matching and not make any arithmetic mistakes
Right.
along the way. And and that gets you to a certain baseline, but
Yeah.
eventually to be a research, just to do R&D, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to do something that hasn't been done before.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to be familiar with all of the things that you might use, but you kind of have to wander out into the unknown and it can't
Mm-hmm.
be perfect at that point. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've seen a lot of students struggle with this idea that being smart is the same as being perfect and always knowing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. That's a
Uh,
super important point.
and that to really get into research, you have to do enough planning that you're not wasting your time.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't wait until you are sure.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's interesting because I think that detailed oriented, I mean, I remember when we were working together, feels like an eternity ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. Um, we spent a lot of time sort of pondering this transition that students make, because as you go to a lot of the students that end up pursuing a graduate degree did well in high school, did well in college, and they're sort of used to this structure where there's a formulaic way to tackle a problem, and ideally they get exposed to sort of thinking outside the box on exams and things like on homeworks, but sometimes that doesn't end up happening. And in some sense, I feel like the students that can kind of capture the big ideas and use those concepts in a more fluid way and are not tethered to these like minus signs and two pies can actually do very well in research.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that it's that you should that the best researchers are the people that like just totally bombed all the
Oh,
homeworks,
no,
but
no, no, no.
there is this interplay between the two that I think is important.
And I really think that the way my undergrad was taught was actually very helpful for
Mm,
this. Like right now I teach at UMD
mm,
and the default is the standard high school 10-point scale.
mhm,
90% and above is an A, 80 to 90 is a B. And
mhm,
what that means is that if you are doing well in this course, nobody ever asks you a question you don't know the answer to.
mhm.
Right. An A student should have a 95% average. Every single thing you were asked to do, you just go, "Oh, yeah, do it."
Yeah.
Um, and that people get very used to that.
Yeah.
That's what knowledge means. And like, in TV, when they want to show how smart someone is, they give them either multiple PhD degrees or they know all of the trivia in the entire world. Who was
Yeah.
king of Myanmar in 1809?
Right.
Right. Whereas what we would say is that intelligence is the ability to synthesize new knowledge
Mhm.
from old knowledge.
Mhm.
And you can be really, really smart and know very little.
Yeah.
It's how much can you do with what you know?
Mhm.
And this sort of 10-point scale actually really penalizes that
Mhm.
because if you if you're doing something new and you're thinking and you don't recognize this problem,
Mhm.
you're going to get it half right or three-quarters right.
Yeah.
Whereas an A student needs to get it fully right.
Mhm.
Um, and the first physics exam that I took in college, I
Mhm.
thought I did really well. I walked out and I heard everybody talking about it and I went, "Oh no, I screwed up." Okay, I called my mom. I was in tears,
Yep.
you know. And then a week later, the results were posted. I got like an 80% and a B plus.
Mhm.
And it really hit me. This is a different league here.
Yeah.
But it's a different way of doing things.
Mhm.
Um, that they don't expect me. The point is not to have seen all this before and recognize it and immediately do it.
Yeah.
They were going to give me a challenge question and see how far I could go.
Mhm.
And so I, I've sometimes gone as far as telling students, like, what I want to see is that you can start all the questions.
Yeah.
Not that you can finish all the questions, but
Mhm.
start all the questions and finish some.
Mhm.
And that mean and that what I'm looking for on an exam is not, do you just have this cold? Have you already seen this?
Yeah.
Or can I tell that if you had 3 hours to go home and pick up
Mhm.
a book and search the internet, that then you could solve it?
Mhm.
You've got
Mhm.
half an hour right now. Show me that you have enough of a start that you could finish it.
Yeah.
And that was much more how my undergrad was taught.
Hmm.
Um, and so I felt that research was not such a big change from that,
Hmm.
where you could get an 80% and have an A. And
Yeah.
it was like, can you dive in here and do
Mhm.
something halfway sensible?
Mhm.
And for a really hard new problem that's never been solved before, that's your only choice, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot there. Well, so this I think kind of leads. I feel like we can spend a lot of time in all these stages, but I think one of the things that I thought of that takes me knowing a lot about your background. I feel like a lot of this rubber met the road when you were in a PhD program and had to build your big microscope, which was a
Yeah.
huge. I mean, that sort of puts together a lot of what you did in the past, right? Like this, you're a builder and you wanted to
Yeah.
build a very, very complicated tool and machine. And
Partly didn't know how complicated it was going to be, but no,
what was that process like? Like, what skills did you put to use from, say, college and before it, as a grad student doing research for the first time?
yeah. And so it turns out that I learned a huge amount of the skills that I used in grad school, from my dad fixing stuff around the house.
Hmm.
Um,
That's a lot of scientist stories, actually. I think
like,
Feynman, you know, interesting character there.
yeah,
Yeah, but
like I
like I think
remember,
he was building ham radios.
yeah,
Everyone knows him as a theorist, but he really liked tinkering and building stuff.
yeah. And like my dad's a mathematician, but he fixed stuff around the house and he
Mhm.
did woodworking. And I remember he bought miniature tools. And
Mhm.
I remember thinking I could use my dad's tools, and now I go back and realize I must have been about 7.
Oh, that's really
So
cute.
he bought like miniature tools, little teeny hammerhead or whatever,
Yeah.
and he bought me like a mini saw,
Uh-huh.
but it was a real saw. It was just a short one to go with. Uh,
No less dangerous.
yes, and so we had father-daughter 2x4 cutting
Oh,
in
wow.
the backyard, and so he'd lay the 2x4 out on this like raised flower bed.
Mhm.
Um, and I was like too small to hold the 2x4 down, and so like he would stand on it while I cut the 2x4.
That's
Large amount of
funny.
sawdust produced, not a lot of 2x4s cut. Um,
But that actually sort of surprises me, knowing a bit about your dad. Do you think that was sort of partially him saving face with his engineer family, or is
I
that tied to his own math, leaning? Like, how does that?
some of it was, I think, a family culture of
Mhm.
you don't pay people to do this stuff. Like
Mhm.
there had not really been money for that.
Mhm.
Um, but one of the things is that like there's no experimental and theoretical math.
Right.
And so in physics, if somebody has those kind of build it skills,
Mhm.
they almost always end up an experimentalist.
Mhm.
But in math, that's like, can you fix your own faucet and what are your hobbies? It doesn't have anything to do with
Yeah, true,
what
true.
you actually do. But what it taught me was, I think, physics in action. If
Mhm.
I do this action, what will the actual physical consequence
Mhm.
be? And it's something that I see that a lot of the grad students don't have.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
you're trying to assemble this thing and the screw won't go in. What do you do?
Yeah.
And you jiggle it and you feel for it. But how do you explain that to someone who hasn't
Right.
felt
Yeah.
it before? Um, And so I had experimentalist skills, but like everyone, your exposure to physics, popular physics is much more on the theory side.
Right.
And my dad came from math, and so the first job that I got was an experimental job, which I
Mhm.
got by walking up to my mechanics professor and saying, "Can I work for you?" The traditional route. And so he was a cosmologist, which is nothing to do with what I do now. And they had
Uh-huh.
three of them had a joint lab. So there was sort of an army of undergrads, like 5 or 6 of us that summer. Um, and my first job was, well, first it was to get some slimy cables out from underneath some random construct on the roof that had a wasp's nest.
I remember
That would
something about the roof of Jadwin in Balba
Yes,
in that
yes.
story.
And drink lots of water, don't get heat stroke. It was a high base. Uh,
Okay,
but
go.
then pretty much. But my main job that summer was to design and build a support structure for a telescope that was going to ship out to Chile.
Mm.
And so I sat down and used 3D modeling software for the first time and
Mm.
ordered metals from, and like I had to document my whole design and show it to everyone. And then we
Right.
like went through multiple revisions. It came, and then I spent my summer assembling it and figuring out that I had designed it wrong. I
Mhm.
should confess that it was taller than the shipping container that it had to go inside of.
Yeah, it's
You
hard to
know,
think
and
that
then
far ahead. I mean,
and
I
then
remember some of my first projects, like you're barely your scope of vision. And now as a professor, like you kind of have to have this big vision of the project sort of before any of it even gets done. And that's always constantly evolving. But
no,
I remember in the beginning, my one of my first projects, it was a coding. I actually thought it was an experimental group. I show up and I open the door and it's a bunch of computers, no windows, and it's a computational physics group. And I had not taken a coding class. And so I spent all this time basically being like, they gave me a set of code and then they said, all right, now do this statistical mechanics project. Complicated. I hadn't taken that class either. So,
yep,
well, like totally unprepared for this project. And what did I do? I figured out how to run the code. And then I said, what if I change this? It would crash. What if I change that? And I basically just tinkered my way through to actually getting something to work. And, but you start with this very small scope of your understanding of the project. Maybe even just like, can I run the
yeah,
code?
yeah.
Um,
Like, well, this reminds me, I built this big machine in grad school, or he said, and after I built it on the lab wiki, I put like Alicia's rules of machining and design.
uh,
And the first rule on Alicia's rules of machining and design is if one part is supposed to go inside the other, make sure that the thing on the inside is actually physically smaller than the hole that it has to go into and not the same size.
yeah,
Because you go into, in software, a 1 inch rod fits in a 1 inch hole.
of course. Yeah.
In practice, less than half the time. You you feel like does the 1 inch rod fit in the 1 inch hole? And
Hmm.
so, and you check it and it says everything is fine, and then you get it and it goes thunk.
Yeah.
No.
Turns out it's
Uh,
not absolutely perfect.
exactly. And then, the hole maker guys were having a bad day, and so they made it like significantly less than an inch.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then you have to go down to the machine shop and try to like make your rod smaller or make your hole
Right.
bigger. Um,
Hmm.
and those are always harder to fix after the fact than to get it right at the beginning. Um, but yeah, so I spent my first summer in physics, up to my eyeballs in machine oil
Hmm.
and loving it basically. I had my own forklift. You remember
Yes.
this forklift, right?
Yeah.
And so I was building this big cube to hold up the telescope out of
Uh-huh.
I-beam, and the top bar was probably about 6 or 7 feet long, and it weighed like 130 pounds, and it needed to go 7 feet in the air.
Uh-huh.
And so like, how do you hold that up there so it doesn't fall on you while you bolt everything together? And so there was this ancient red manual forklift.
Uh-huh.
Um, it was pedal action. There was just you pump on it with your foot and it would go up, and then you hit a release and it would flip
Yeah.
it down. And it was somehow a really tall forklift.
Mm.
And the physics department had like four others, including ones with like actual motors and stuff that like, sure, yeah, take this one. And so I took it and it wasn't tall enough. And so I unbolted the forks of the forklift and I turned them upside down because that got me an extra couple of feet, um, which still wasn't enough. This is very Alicia story. It still wouldn't
Yeah.
fall enough.
That's
Uh, so then I went and found some 4x4s and I bolted those to my forks, and that still wasn't tall enough. I needed like another inch.
uh-huh.
What around this place is like an inch thick? And I found some 1 inch bolts, 1 inch nuts. So I
Uh-huh.
put those under the 4x4s and then I bolted the whole thing together. And then it was finally tall enough that I could put my I-beams on.
It's pretty funny.
Oh,
Yeah, but that's sort of, I mean, in some sense, I feel like that's a metaphor. Um, especially, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about what it's like to start a lab because, I think a lot of what we're trying to get at is the road to where we are at our stages of our careers. But I think there's something to be said for that, like, kind of creative problem solving approach. Now, there's a
Yeah.
lot of ways to get research done, but I think for me and I think for you, it's sometimes you're just sitting around, and whether it's a conceptual tool or like a physical tool, you're saying, like, what tools do I have in my toolbox? And what can I do that's new? In your case, you had a bunch of 2x4s and bolts and a forklift, but I feel like that's actually kind of a metaphor for like what you're doing as a scientist, at least if you're coming up with the projects. But
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think is going on here is certainly running around the basement with a crescent wrench the size of your head and an egregiously modified forklift is not like people's idea of what a research physicist is. Um, like
yeah, I mean, the papers that were written from that lab were what? I mean, it's like very hardcore astrophysics,
polarization measurements in the cosmic microwave background.
which is
Uh,
very, very deep, very complicated physics.
and so it can seem like too fancy for you to ever know what's going on or contribute to. Um,
Had you read any of those? Probably you just had a professor in your class and you said, "Hey, this guy's cool."
exactly. And I worked in that lab for 2 summers, and it taught me that I really liked building things,
Mhm,
and I was still a bit in denial about whether I should be a theorist or not.
mhm.
Um, and
Princeton
then
kind of shifts you towards the theory direction.
yeah, I mean, I had friends who were like, blowing off class to read string theory. I'm not sure it worked out well, but like, there was one day in my junior year where it just became clear that Alicia is an experimentalist because the way that Princeton was at the time, the classes ended before Christmas and the exams were after Christmas. And so it
Which
was
is
fall of my junior year.
weird.
Uh, anyway, if you have the right mentality, you can put it out of your head. But
Yeah.
so classes ended. I turned in my last homework. It was like Quantum 2 and Stat Mac and a bunch of other thought stuff. And I was like, yes, I'm done with homework. I want to do something fun. And so what did I decide to do? I decided to go back down to the basement and unmodify my forklift and put it back in normal operating configurations. Like,
Which is good lab etiquette, by the way.
yes.
Don't just leave your work as a total mess,
Yeah.
unusable.
But it's like, okay, so your idea of fun is to go borrow 2 giant wrenches and take apart a forklift and put it back together again.
Yeah.
Why do you think that you are a theorist? Uh,
Right. Yeah. That's pretty funny.
yeah. And we kept using that forklift for years. It was funny. It made an appearance when
It did.
Matthias was a grad student, um, and I was a postdoc.
I feel like we use it. We certainly use it in this project, right? But
Yeah, we did.
did we use it also when we were installing the new fridge?
Yes. Yeah. And so, I mean, for
Was
better
it
or
right where you
worse,
left it?
it was, well, so I was a brand new postdoc. I'd been there for like 3 or 4 weeks, and the new fridge arrived, and it was time to install it. And
I
we
guess for
needed to
the
get it.
context for the when we say fridge, we mean very, very fancy fridge.
Yes.
That both Alicia and I have our own versions of now that makes me very happy. And it's currently running, which is good. But these are dilution refrigerators, which are very, very fancy, very expensive pieces of equipment that get things very, very cold, close to absolute zero.
And they come in a couple of custom crates, and so you have to like assemble the frame and then take the main part out of the crate and then like hang it in the frame.
And
So
sometimes those crates don't fit in elevators and you have to take them out.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
it's the whole ordeal.
And so we have to lift the fridge out of the crate and then carry it to the frame and hang it in there. And it weighs probably about 600 pounds or something
Yeah,
like this.
something like that.
So it's not just give it the old heave ho. This is like you need
You'll
something
still want to drop
close
that
to lift
thing.
it. Uh, and so we were looking around, and I said we need a forklift, and we were up in the electrical engineering department, and the grad students looked around and went, "Yeah, that sounds right. We need a forklift." Okay, we're up in engineering. There's a loading dock. Do we have forklifts? And they went, Loading dock, forklifts, what?" Um, so I was like, "Okay, guys, I have contacts in the physics department." And so I went down the hill to the physics department where I was an undergrad, where they had their like 6 forklifts. And my old one was like shoved into a back corner to get it out of the bed. And it's like, "Can I borrow this?" They're like, "Yeah, sure, whatever. It's taking up space. Go." Um, and so I took the forklift from the physics department at the bottom of the hill and I pushed it up the hill myself
Which is a
to
big hill.
it was a
Right.
big hill. There was some rather horizontal pushing there.
And the
Um,
wheels, I don't think we're up to the task.
it had metal wheels and no suspension. And so I just like clattered and banged and rattled my way up to the top of the hill.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
and took it up to the top. It was so loud. Uh, Hilariously, I got home that night and my mother was like, "I saw this lunatic pushing a forklift up."
Oh gosh.
Anyway, so we used it to install the fridge, and then I had nightmares of the runaway forklift if I tried to roll it back down the hill to the physics department. We were
Right.
sort of always too lazy to take it back. It was just hanging out for years.
Yeah.
And then we used it for the hyperbolic lattice project because we needed to get something high up in the air.
Yeah.
But
Oh gosh. Yeah, we should get to that. I guess we're already pretty far in here. Um, I guess we can maybe just jump into that right now. I did kind of want to hear a little bit about um your PhD project because I think that was another really big build.
yeah,
Um, I don't know, maybe we spend a few minutes chatting about that because I thought that was a really, really that sort of was a tour de force of all your building and a lot of your design work that you had learned as an undergrad. Um, and yeah, objectively, I think a much harder problem.
yeah. I mean, I think I certainly had no idea going in how big of a project it was going to be. Um, and I certainly got lucky that I actually like the building phase of
Right.
projects. A lot of other people got tired of building long before they were done building, and
Yeah.
I was thoroughly surprised one day when I was done building. It's like, oh no, it has to work now. Crap.
Which was after a few years, as I recall, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somewhere in my 4th year, I think, was the oh crap, it has to work now.
Which is another thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand. You and I probably both work with undergrads that, so at Dartmouth we have or on quarters, so it's really 9.5 week terms. And I'll have students that kind of want to join my lab and think that after 9 weeks they kind of can get anything done. Um, and of course you can if you really know what you're doing, but a lot of this, what we're talking about here, like where you can actually get a paper out of it, is oftentimes a lot of work. Of course, depends on the field, but in your case, you were building that experiment. Maybe high level, if you could explain what that
Yeah,
what that's about.
so uh
Colder
that
than our
experiment,
fridges, by the way, right?
yes, although not necessarily in ways that matter.
Right.
And so that experiment was we were really trying to build a test bed for interesting sort of quantum condensed matter problems out of stuff that's cleaner and more well controlled than
Hmm.
actual electrons in actual materials. Um, And so we were using one specific isotope of rubidium as our particle, and then we were trying to control it with light. Um, so there's a field known as ultra cold atoms or optical lattices and things like this. Um, but what it meant was that we needed to build a vacuum chamber to control all of the atoms. We had to have the atoms inside. They came out of the source way too hot, so we had to use lasers to remove all of the extra heat and cool it down. And then I was coupling this with something called an optical cavity. You'd imagine like two mirrors facing each other. I think the best analogy is one of those weird mall bathrooms where there's a mirror on both sides, and so you see like 60 copies of yourself.
Uh-huh.
And this one had like 10,000 copies of yourself, is what you would have seen if you were inside of there.
Pretty good mirrors.
Yes. But what it meant really was that I needed to get good at 3D design, and I had to assemble the vacuum chamber. We did optics, I did electronics, I did water plumbing. I did a lot of water plumbing. I did code to simulate this thing. I also did a lot of code to control this thing. I mean, that's something that we experimentalists do all the time is hardware control. Your computer is running a bunch of other equipment. And I feel like that's something that nobody ever teaches in an undergrad CS course. But we have to do all the time, and it's Byzantine.
But one aspect, because that's totally correct, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think, yeah, I mean, certainly as an experimentalist, and I'm sure this applies to theory as well in its own sense, but what do you think gave you the confidence to just be thrown into a project like that? Like, how did you know that you could just tackle these new domains that really were like not things that you planned on going into? I remember when we were working together, you talked about how you sort of fell in love with control theory, uh, and had no, that was something that wouldn't have shown up unless you had done that project. So, but I think there's a crossroads that happens there where you're like, oh crap, to solve this problem, I need to learn this. And I think,
I think
yeah, what gave you the sort of ability to know that you could do that?
I think it was a combination of curiosity and boredom. Um,
Sure.
like I I was excited by learning something new and bored by the idea of perfecting something that I had already done. Um, and so I really liked that aspect of my PhD project, that I was always working on something different. I know that there are other people that drove them batty. They just
Yeah.
felt that they never knew what they were doing. And I was like, I'm on to a new thing. I'm learning this today.
Yeah.
And if I can't stand the thought of doing any more water plumbing, I'm going to come in tomorrow and I'm going to do electronics.
Right.
And so the variety of it really appealed. And it turns out that I definitely am more inclined to be a sort of jack of all trades
Right.
with mid-level of knowledge about many things as opposed to sort of the grand master of a narrower area. And that's really a personality thing. And I found a project that really matched me there.
Yeah, which is an
So
interesting point because I think there's it can go either way. I personally feel like it's a relief to have to do a lot of different types of things because when I am bored, as you said, or I've been doing one type of thing for too long, I can hop into something else. It's interesting and I can keep making progress. Now, there's a fine line between that, which is sort of like you're hopping onto these different things to make sure that you keep your like sort of forward trajectory. I think one of the things that happens to a lot of people is the scope of a project is very open-ended. Like you can go in so many directions. Some people just hop to these different things and never make sort of consistent progress. It's
yeah.
sort of and finding that balance is, I think, a lot of what a PhD is about is figuring out how to kind of keep productive in a sort of squishy, very ill-defined thing.
Yeah. I mean, and that reminds like I, I feel like that's a lot of the role of a good advisor. Like, when do we focus? When do we look somewhere else? And I think one of the things that I've seen that people sometimes have trouble with is we make a plan to have a plan, but the plan is always plan A,
Right.
right? And so the the plan is always subject to revision upon more data.
Uh-huh.
And so, I've sometimes talked to my students of like, let's try this. And then they try it and I realize that's not the right thing to do. And then they're like, but weren't we doing that? It's like, no, I changed my mind. It's not
Right.
working. Yeah. So like it's some balance between sticking to a plan because it needs to get done
Right.
and sticking to a goal because a goal needs a plan.
Right.
Uh and when I started in grad school, I sort of relied on my advisor's confidence that we could build this thing.
Yeah.
And on the theory side, I was very confident that I could go learn this, and the 3D modeling of the device, that all felt instinctive to me. And even the, oh crap, it doesn't fit. Okay, what are we gonna do? That was familiar, but there were other things that really scared me because what I didn't like was feeling like if I push this button, I have no idea what will happen.
Oh.
Uh,
And that's
and
something that's sometimes inevitable when you're making a very custom, very,
yeah,
no one's built exactly that same thing.
or like it happens a lot that something's not working.
Mm.
And if I push this button, it might start working, or it might get very broken.
Yeah.
Right? It was only mildly broken before, but now it's really broken.
Right.
And so at the beginning with the actual experiment,
Uh-huh.
I that made me super, super nervous.
Right.
And over time, I got to feel that I I sort of knew which was the explode volcano button and which was the like turn the radio dial and I can just turn it back.
Right.
Uh, but like I had
Is
a
that
lab
just
mate.
exposure? Like what? I mean, obviously your advisor helped with that, but
A
eventually
lot
you
of
were
it
doing
was
that on your own.
exposure. A lot of
Yeah.
it was exposure and seeing other people, like I vividly remember my lab mate Nate, they had a Verdi laser. This is a high power green laser, like I don't know, $50,000, $80,000.
Uh-huh.
And it was broken.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, well, we can stare at the box and it'll stay broken, or we can open the box and maybe we can fix it. But
Right.
it's also possible that the moment you stick your hand in there, you break something even more.
Right.
And Nate was really able to just look at that and go, well, if I do nothing, we're hosed.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do it. Um, and that was something that I really struggled with at the beginning, and I eventually got maybe not more comfortable with it, but felt like I could more accurately predict whether I was going to break the thing or not.
Yeah.
Therefore, I was like, I'm gonna do it.
Yeah.
But it took me a while to get comfortable enough with the experiment
Uh-huh.
to do some of those things. And that was one of the biggest learning curves for me.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of it was like really learning to embrace the sort of like cost benefit analysis.
Right.
Um, and the if I do nothing, this will never get fixed.
Right. And
So
dealers with
really just
uncertainty, you know, I think that that's a lot of it. And I remember when we were working together, and still today, I feel like the vast majority of the conversations I have with people are kind of a strategy session. Like, you're sort of laying out options, and then sort of you have some heuristic that says, well, what are the probability of success, and trying to look as far forward as possible. But at some point you have to make a decision, you have to roll the dice, and your ability to ascertain like that, essentially your ability to like develop that heuristic of like, oh, I think this is a good direction to go in, is just always honed over time. Like that's really what a job of
Yeah.
a scientist is like learning how to make those
Like,
decisions.
those decisions are, as far as I can tell, the highest level of research skill.
Mm-hmm.
Like, here's a task. Like, as you go from undergrad to grad school, you get harder and harder tasks with more and more complicated pieces.
Yep.
And that's sort of the standard. And people get better and better at this, and they get better and better at debugging these tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but the really highest level is, should I be doing this? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I have my goal. What should I be working on? Or you run into a roadblock and you have to decide, am I going around, or do we just have to batter our way through here?
Yeah.
Right. Um, and that's and those are hard decisions to make. And I mean,
Yeah.
as advisors, that's a lot of what we are
Yep.
deciding. Um, Sometimes I feel like all that I do is try to go from a 50-50 coin toss to a 60-40 coin toss.
Yeah.
Right. We've got new data that suggests this plan is more likely to work than
Yeah.
fail.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try this plan.
Yeah.
And then we keep going from there until it finally
And then I think that,
converges.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, because as I'm looking at you on Zoom, I'm seeing the hyperbolic lattice itself. And yeah, I want to get to the sometimes you just barrel through phase, because there was
Yeah.
a point at which that was exactly what we were doing. Um, but yeah, you also brought up that sometimes you're doing a thing that's actually sort of just a really, really complicated version of something that you have done before, or seen in a class somewhere. But like the design for the hyperbolic lattice, a lot of what I did in the project was the build the circuit design that's behind Alicia on the video recording. And in some sense it's a pretty easy problem, or it's not. It's all trigonometry. It's like
Yep.
you have certain constraints. All of those little squiggly lines have to be the same length, and they have to be connected in this interesting way. Uh, Now that's kind of straightforward. There's a lot of angles, you have to calculate arc lengths and all of these things, and you have to make sure that things come together at the right angle. And in some sense, that is something that I've known how to do since high school. Like, the basic trigonometry of that. In principle, I've seen in high school. But this was like
Yeah.
that on steroids, right? And since then I think your lab has gone way further with that. But that was a really interesting experience for me in grad school, because it's not very sexy. um but the end product is worth it, and there's a lot of that. And then specifically you're talking about barreling through. There was a period at the end where we were basically at the device that's behind Alicia on the recording and in the paper, in figure. I'm going to link to the paper in the podcast, but we're talking about figure 6B, this beautiful chip.
Yeah.
Actually, great. I have a little version of it. Um, but yeah, there was a period where we really needed to hammer out some systematic errors, and I spent, as a grad student with lots of young 20-something-year-old energy, there was like a few days in a row where I basically prepared a bunch of these chips in the clean room, and I pulled like pretty much an all-nighter where I would prep, 6 or 7 of these things. I would go into the clean room, gown up in my bunny suit, start to write, leave, come back 2 hours later, and did this all night essentially. And that helped us get the final product. And a lot of that was, to be honest, brute forcing it just to
Yeah.
get things done. But that's a lot of what science is sometimes. Obviously, it'd be nice if everything was elegant and beautiful, but a lot of times, if that's the case, somebody's already done it before.
Yeah.
So,
I'm laughing a little bit because this reminds me of a story from my PhD where we were trying to take the first data for the first paper from our apparatus. We'd be working for 5 years. Okay.
yeah.
Want this paper. And there's some light that we were using to control the cavity, but that light was interfering with our atoms. And so we couldn't do our atom measurements with that light on. But if we turned that light off, the cavity flew apart. And so we had to turn this light off at the end of every run and measure, but we needed it back and the cavity back set up again for the next run. And so we took data, our final data sets that are in papers, with me standing on a stool using like one hand to servo out the heating from our big laser and the other hand to try to relock the cavity. Maybe I could do it one-handed. It was maybe the same knob.
Yeah.
But for one data set, our rep rate was about 36 seconds.
Oh gosh.
And so I had a very high success rate of relocking the cavity within 20 seconds. And so I just stood on this stool. Image, okay, relock the cavity. Image. Several hours of data like that. And then we went to this other.
Was that also like weird hours? Because a lot of were you trying to avoid people in the building disturbing stuff, or
That was not our trouble. So that was the middle of the day.
okay.
But then we went to our final configuration that we wanted to be in, where it was harder to lock the cavity. And then we'd reached the point where it took me longer to lock the cavity than the cycle. We still had to take data. And so I stood on the stool, image. And then it would take me about a minute to relock the cavity. And then I would say, go. My lab partner would hit run. 30 seconds, image. And then I would go. We took, I don't know, a few hundred runs this way.
It's like, are these error bars okay?
We are done with
Enough
it.
data.
Exactly. And then it took us about 9 months to redo the system well enough so that we didn't have to do that again. But like, in some sense, that's research, right? That you're, at least of the kind that I like, but you're sort of always on the frontier. There's something that's being done the first time or in the newest way, and that's always hanging together by a thread. Because if it's not, then you could turbo the project more.
Yeah, and sort of the turboed version is probably a commercially viable thing that you can buy.
Yeah.
And a lot of fridges, for instance, we're talking about our fancy, very expensive fridges. There was a time when everyone that wanted to do similar research, now it wasn't quantum computing related research like Alicia and I do. It was more like condensed matter physics and things like that. Step one was build your own dilution refrigerator, which feels a lot like what you were doing in grad school, building. Yeah, you spent a whole PhD building this tool that is just the beginning. Like, it just gets you to the place where you can take data.
And research is always about sort of pushing the boundary of what's possible a little bit further. And one of my undergrad advisors gave me really good advice when I was going to grad school. And the more I have done work in physics, the more true I realize it is. And we were looking at potential groups for me to work in. And he said, there are two kinds of groups: the groups that get the first data and the groups that get the best data. Decide which one of these you want to do, because they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I have always worked in first data groups,
Hmm.
right? And it means that you get the data set by hook or by crook, standing on a stool with your finger in a hole in the dike. That's what needs to happen.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not precision chi-squared analysis, 10 to the minus 2 p-value, like
Yeah.
none of that stuff. It's often very qualitative. We saw it or we didn't see it.
Yeah.
It gets bigger, it gets smaller.
Hmm.
But somebody had to go there first.
Yeah.
And once you've seen it, once it's been there once, then someone, maybe the same group later on, or maybe an entirely different group, comes back, does a much more careful job, and like one of the things that we see all the time is that if this experiment's never been done before, you can't spec out before you do it
Yeah.
actually what the hardware requirements are.
Hmm.
You have a reasonable guess, but you don't really know. And so
Right.
you often have to like try it once and only then can you design the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
And people that like building that first line system and people that like building the second generation system, they're two rather different groups of people, actually.
Right.
Um,
It reminds me a bit of LIGO, so the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, which sort of made a bunch of headlines and is now sort of churning out all these really incredible measurements of merging of black holes and all this really exotic physics happening very, very far from us. Um, I think it was Kip Thorne was at Princeton giving a lecture. I'm not sure if you were around when that was happening, but
probably didn't see it.
he kind of gave this whole historical perspective, having sort of been around for a lot of years and a lot of sort of dedicated funding um, from, I feel like, I want to say the 80s, but I'll have to check on that. But many, many years, right, where they were sort of trying to build this apparatus. And what struck me in what he was describing was that, with the state of the art technology they had when they started this process and were starting to build all this stuff, they never would have had the sensitivity to measure anything interesting. Now, after like 20 or 30 years of really building this and allowing for the other hardware to catch up, that's really when that all came together, was when they got all these miraculous, sort of really amazing measurements. But that kind of struck me that there was enough faith in, well, although maybe it was naivete, but I like to think that there was a sense that the other hardware would eventually catch up and that they would get to where they needed to go. But I think it was a bit of both, a bit of just sort of diving in the deep end and a little bit of sort of trusting that the technology will catch up. Um,
Yeah, I think that, and that has happened a lot. I mean,
Mhm.
maybe I think that similar things in some sense have happened in superconducting circuits where we work that, but in my PhD experiment, I used to joke that my job was to take really nice pieces of equipment and try to get them to do things that they were never meant to do, abuse them into doing things. And so, but it's pretty common, I would say, in experimental physics that you take a piece of equipment that was designed for something quite different from what you're doing,
Mhm.
and you use it in an unintended way or an unintended context.
Right.
And if that context becomes successful enough, then there's a next generation of equipment that's designed
Just
for
specific.
your job, not Eric, come over
Yeah.
here and do this.
And it costs
You
10
know,
times as much.
it's a little bit, to make a silly analogy, right? You want to go off-roading and the only thing you have is a car. And so you start by putting big wheels on it, you start by raising it, maybe
Yeah.
you turn on the engine, and then eventually somebody says, this is a good idea, and they start Land Rover. And
Uh-huh.
now you can buy a 4x4, which works way better than, or at
It
least
reminds
is
me of like
way
the
less
Volkswagen
fuel.
Bugs that they race in the Baja 1000.
Yeah, beach
J-
buggies and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
But
yeah.
I think
No.
that happens a lot, that you push the equipment to a frontier that it's never seen before.
Mhm.
Um, and eventually new generations of equipment come out, sometimes because of the actual physics market,
Mhm.
and sometimes because of other markets,
Mhm.
right? Like my PhD was with rubidium, and there was kind of a revolution in rubidium lasers because rubidium is at 780 nanometers and the DVD is at 785.
Mm. Mhm.
DVD players use 785, and so there was like,
Mm.
but at 785 you can buy a $15 laser diode, and at
Mhm.
780 you buy a $3,000 laser diode,
Mhm.
uh, and so sometimes these funny classical technologies come along at a specific
Yeah.
wavelength band or thing, and like a lot of what we do is really benefited from cell phone technologies and things
Right.
like this. Uh,
Yeah, we have all this wonderful electronics for measuring generating signals and measuring them. And then we also leverage all this semiconductor technology for the fabrication that you sort of alluded to. Um, the entire field wouldn't be possible without those two things. Um, so I guess, I mean, we're kind of getting to the end here. I was wondering if you had some sort of thoughts about having been doing this for a big chunk of your life now. Is there any sort of advice you would give to, someone like yourself when you were in, say, middle school or high school? Or, I mean, advice, I feel like as I get older, you end up like walking through these phases of life where people have given you advice. And then when you're on the other side, you realize that the advice you'd give is the same advice you got, but you just didn't get it at the time.
yes, yes, yes,
But
it didn't mean
nonetheless,
anything.
yeah, nonetheless, like, or at least what would be an insight that you wish you could have just like given to yourself that would have helped sort of ease the process and helped you
Um,
through.
I mean, maybe I'll turn this around a little bit. It's like I think I was a sort of weird middle schooler, high schooler, and so for me, the farther into physics I got, the more I felt like these were my people.
Mhm.
And I felt far more alienated as your average middle schooler than as a science nerd, as a physics major, as a
Mhm.
physics grad student.
Mhm.
And so so for me, it was about like waiting long enough to be in a large enough group to find my people. And like,
Right.
in an elementary school classroom, there's 30 people, and the chance of
Right.
there being a comparable nerd is small. Go to
Yeah.
college, and now it's 1,000 people, and okay, there's 20 of you, and you can all be friends.
Right.
Um, and one of the things that I see people doing a lot, and it's very, on the far side, it's easy for me to say, if like
Mhm.
people are over planning,
Yeah.
like first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go to this college, and then I'm going to work with this group, and then I'm going to go to this grad school, and
Yeah.
there's very long sort of interdependent chains, or like they decided this is the person that I should work with for grad school,
Mhm.
and so I'm going to go to this school and I'm going to work in that group, and then it turns out he
Mhm.
doesn't have an opening.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think like the key advice that I would give to people is you got to have like a starting plan.
Mhm.
And the goal of the next step is that it should give you good options to
Yeah.
come after.
Yeah. You
That
learn
you
something ideally useful, right?
and that and you don't if you get your heart set on a 5 or 10 year roadmap when you're 20,
Yeah.
right? It's not gonna happen.
Mhm.
Um, and so that your goal is much more to not box yourself in.
Right.
Like, and uh, you know, I had somebody email me that he likes physics, but he's worried it's not going to give him enough options after undergrad, so should he switch to electrical engineering?
Uh-huh.
You know, I don't think he really should, but it's like you don't you don't need to be bound to the next step for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to take a next step that really boxes you in.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
if I decided to drop physics degree and go into vocal performance, there's that closes off a lot of options.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe that works out. But
Mhm.
it closed a lot of doors behind me. Um, and there's a lot of good paths. There's a lot of good advisors and good research projects that you don't even know about.
Right.
Um,
And
you
that
gave this
also
example of
influence.
control theory for me
Right.
that
That also influences you down the road. I mean, I think now I feel like working with Andrew Houck at Princeton as a PhD student, he was incredibly hands off, and um, we had excellent resources. He was always there to bounce ideas off of and get help, but it was very hands off. And I think that works for some people and it doesn't work for others.
yeah,
But for me, it was a freedom that um, ended up being like so enriching. And what I realized after sort of continuing to do science in a lot of different settings and a lot, you know, you learn that what I decide to do, we were talking about this heuristic of this decision making. That's all influenced by your previous experiences. And I think in a very optimistic way, like having a variety of experiences and exposure makes you a really unique person to tackle. Like different people tackling the same problem will do different things. And it's
yeah,
not so much about, sure, there's some people that are very efficient at it and they churn out wonderful, like huge high impact papers. But on the other hand, I think some people can have really, really deep insights because they have this like perfect alchemy of backgrounds that's super unique and sometimes weird.
yes.
Um, that gives them this really perfect niche, you know? And I think that's freed me up entirely in my career, especially now as a PI. It's like, on the one hand, you're looking around being like, oh, should I just try to do what my advisor did? No, just do what you think you should do and what feels right. And I think if you keep if you keep chugging along at it, good stuff will happen, right? I think
And
you have to be patient and open to new experiences and learning, but then good stuff will happen, you know?
like one of the things that's I think not clear from the outside is that, as physics professors, our job is to think creatively about science.
Yeah.
How to do science and what science should we be doing?
Yeah.
Um, and in some ways, that's the line between fundamental science and engineering. If it's a known goal that's clearly valuable and you need to figure out how to do it well and repeatably,
Hmm.
yeah, someone who doesn't know what they're doing needs to be able to come up and push the on button and needs to work for 20,000 hours.
Yeah.
That's the far end of engineering. And what we are trying to do is, what should somebody be trying to turn into a box like that?
Yeah.
Or if we had this tool, we'd be able to learn this thing. Okay, so let's try to build that tool.
Right.
But our job really is to be creative and combine new ideas.
Hmm.
And so and there's some goals that are sort of obvious and you work towards them.
Hmm.
But a lot of the time, the breakthrough is from some lateral thinking.
Yeah.
Um,
And to me, that's where the art, title of this podcast is People, Passion, Process, the Art of Scientific Discovery. And I think for me, growing up, I kind of always liked science and math, and um, that sort of made sense. And that sort of, I think, partly with how the education system in this country is set up, it's sort of, I got kind of put into this box, like, oh, you're a science person. And it really wasn't until grad school when I was doing more science than I ever done in my life that I realized that a lot of my appreciation for science actually kind of comes from an aesthetic angle. And that influences, the design for the hyperbolic lattice. I think it's a very striking looking image. And I think it's really neat to sort of juxtapose something that is sort of deeply quantitative, but also very aesthetic. Like I think that drives a lot of my research is curiosity. And a lot of that curiosity is like tied into an aesthetic appreciation for how the world works. Um, you're a musician and singer, so
Mhm.
I feel like there's a lot of that influence as well. I don't know.
Yeah. But I definitely feel that I'm drawn to science because of the creativity in the work.
Yeah.
Um,
Which I
you
think is
mentioned the
totally misunderstood. I think people think that scientists are just like
yeah.
robots that I don't know.
And I think it's a more general thing. Like this is a gross generalization,
Mhm.
but right, like there are certain engineers whose job it is to do a known task and have it work every time.
Right.
Every house you build stands up. Every bridge you build stays there and the cars drive over it.
Yeah.
And your job is not to think outside the box. Your job is to know what the rules are. Your job is to check that it follows the rule
Make sure the
and you
box
build it
ends up.
and it works.
Yeah.
Right. And that kind of person is incredibly useful.
Yeah.
Um, and I would kind of go bonkers doing that job.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's the kind of person that stands at the top of the hill and says, I think if I run fast enough in this rattle trap contraption, it'll fly.
Yep.
Or it's like, we can build a bridge across the Danube and it fell in the first two times, but we're going to do it again. And this time it's going to work. And
Yeah.
we're going to build a cathedral. And when the roof falls in, we're going to try again.
Yeah.
And like this is the scientist and the R&D engineer.
Right.
Um,
It's like an intellectual risk-taking appetite or something. I mean,
and
it's
you
not
can
so
push this
much.
at,
Yeah. Anyway.
and I knew some people that worked in industry R&D on like pulse lasers and cameras,
Hmm.
and I realized that they were doing the same thing,
Right.
maybe not quite with the same goals,
Yeah.
but like my friend Lauren was like, we've done this before at 1 watt.
Uh-huh.
What would it take to do this at 100 watts and have it not melt itself?
Yeah.
And so he had a very technical goal in mind, but it was still, how do I build a thing that has never been built before?
Right.
Um, or Sergio was working with early digital cameras and they had some problem that on half the cameras the image came upside down, like
Uh-huh.
the bottom half above the top half.
Uh-huh.
And it turned out that this was, they were, to be faster, they were reading out the top half of the CCD and the bottom half of the CCD interleaved.
Uh-huh.
And on some of them, there was just enough line delay that they got out of order.
Oof.
Uh, and once they realized that that was what was wrong, they just changed the architecture a little bit so that they never slipped.
Uh-huh.
And then all the cameras worked, and that sounded exactly like problems that we dealt with in the lab. Why is it that sometimes this thing goes off when it's supposed to, and sometimes it goes off over here? What did we do wrong?
Yeah.
So again, it's like we need to make a digital camera that we can sell versus we need to measure this hyperbolic lattice or this
Yeah.
qubit by hook or by crook. But
Yeah.
it's this curiosity, problem solving.
Right.
Um, do you want a new puzzle or do you want an old puzzle? And I
Yeah.
think this is why I would make a terrible sort of standard engineer, just like
Mhm.
bored building house. Oops.
Yeah. Well, some people like the simplicity of that, I think, which is fine. I'm glad those people exist. But yeah, it's
And some
just
people like
research is just
the
not that game so much. I mean,
you have
even
to
the
be
research that is very detail oriented, like you come from cold atoms originally, there are
precision
folks,
measurement things.
yeah, precision measurement folks are just really tamping down on sources of error, and it's seemingly very, very detail oriented, but the types of techniques that they need to come up with to push those limits are often creative in a different
Yeah.
sense, right?
And I think that research, like, one of the things that people don't see from the outside about us is that we live in a world of constant not knowing.
Yeah.
We're not the grand experts that know
Right.
everything. Is like our job is to, quote, start to go where no man has gone before. You
Mhm.
step outside of the comfort zone. I don't know, but I'm gonna find out.
Right.
Right. Like that's how we operate, and you can have this attitude on any problem.
Yeah, and that I'm so glad you brought that up. Um, because that is totally misunderstood, I think. Especially with you and I who have these fancy roles of professor. I feel like from the other side, there's the sense that we're just like some weird encyclopedia of knowing like all the answers to all these problems. And then all of a sudden you're doing this job and you realize that you just have more tools at your disposal and you've been doing it long enough that it's just like second nature to you. But you're still encountering the unknown and sort of by design, I think. One of the things I try to get out of my students is this desire to sort of keep pushing themselves and to keep learning more. That's literally our jobs is to just kind of keep getting into these uncomfortable situations. Like science is a sort of a dramatic process. Like, I mean, there's a lot of failure and there's a lot of struggle.
We're here because we like puzzles,
Yeah. And if you,
right?
and sort of being comfortable with the uncomfortable is probably one of the best skills that you can foster. And I think you have to sort of cultivate the right reward function from that. And I don't know. I just remember you and I we
Yeah.
get so giddy when stuff actually works that it
And you have to
makes it all
treasure the small victories.
worth
I think
and enjoy these hacks of building weird
mm,
forklifts.
I remember sitting in the Hauk Lab one day when we were trying to control this miserable arbitrary waveform generator, digitized, like
Yeah,
high speed signal processing thing
yeah,
that had the worst software in the whole
yeah.
wide world. And I think you were talking to Andrew, and I was like fighting with the code.
Uh-huh.
And then all of a sudden, I just go, I win because I had finally figured out
It was like
how
the
to use
bug where it
it.
wasn't actually setting the
Yeah. And my solution was to look up the number for the variable in the header of the C driver, and then use the MATLAB wrapper function for the C get variable function to query the variable, and then I got it back in MATLAB. And it was the most ridiculous, stupid thing ever.
yeah.
But I remember shouting, "I
Yeah.
win!"
Well, it's like, you take all that really I mean, to be frank, when I was a grad student, I was very impatient. I would get so angry when stuff wouldn't work and I look back and I wish I wasn't like that, but uh, that's where this drama comes in, I feel like. And I think with that bug, it's almost like if you're the type of person that you hit that wall and you're like, "Oh, this doesn't work." And then in your case, you said, okay, well, like, why doesn't it work? And then you have a hypothesis. You go, like, check that out, check out. You keep digging deeper and deeper. And in the end, what you found was it was like a really stupid problem, right? And on the one hand, that's like so frustrating, but you just are the type of person that you like kept digging, which takes more and more effort and can lead to more and more frustration. If you're the type of person that when you get to the end of that, if you can take all of that negative frustration energy and be like, let's go,
Yeah,
then I think research suits you because you're always going to have these negative, like I spent a lot of time frustrated.
yeah,
But if
and like,
if you can turn that frustration around and get a lot of like joy out of the success, then I think research is right.
and I knew people who, when they squashed that bug, would have been like, "Ah, thank God this is done. I can't believe I had to spend a week on this, maybe
Yeah.
more than a week." As opposed to, yes,
Yeah.
it's finished.
Mhm.
And I mean, this was another sort of typical science story that the first person who set this up ran into this bug, and it was a bad bug,
Uh,
and he couldn't get around it. So
yeah.
he found something that let us continue working,
Hmm.
but hole was it prone to having bad bugs, right? Um, and when we first encountered this bug, I had no idea how to fix it.
Yeah.
But we had another thing that we wanted to do. We wanted to parallelize the code, and MATLAB doesn't parallelize.
Hmm.
And so I tried to write control code in Python
Hmm.
where I could parallelize it.
Hmm.
And to write the Python code, I had to use the C driver. And it was
Hmm.
because of that that I knew the
Hmm.
C variable name.
Yeah.
And then the light bulb went off. I know
Right.
how to get this in C. Maybe I can get them that way. And
Right.
we never found the right MATLAB command to get
Yeah.
this variable. Like perfectly normal variables, we never found them.
Right.
And
That's a perfect example of how like all of your previous experiences sort of dictate how you tackle problems, right?
yeah,
Because, you know, back then, yeah, I probably was just chatting and hanging out instead of doing my job. But
the
but you know, like I'm not about to say that you're the only person that could have solved that, but I think that specific experience gave you that light bulb, and you knew how to utilize that sort of random bit of knowledge that somebody else tackling it, maybe they could have come to the same conclusion. We hope that you know, other people could have found that bug, right? But they
maybe
must have
somebody
come
else
about
actually
that
found the
for a
MATLAB
different,
command.
yeah, right. But they might have had different like inspiration and sort of
Yeah.
chain of things to get there. And I think that's kind of the summary of what I hope people get out of these conversations is that as long as you just keep learning and challenging yourself, um, if you enjoy that process and you get a lot of the joy out of like
Yeah.
figuring out these stupid issues or like finally publishing a paper, then research is the right thing for you. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying everyone has to be a researcher, but I think that's kind of the core of why we do it. Um, Sort of known nothing else at this point.
Yeah.
But
And I think we also really liked the part of being on a good team,
hmm.
right? Like the fact that what I knew and what you knew was different, so we put our heads together and we could do more.
Yeah.
Not all areas of research and not all groups function that way, but
Yeah.
we were very happy to make a good team as
Right.
opposed to, oh my God, why do I have to work with someone and he did this the way that I wouldn't have done it, and why would you possibly do it that
Yeah.
way?
Yeah.
And I know people who think that way.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Maybe that goes back to us not caring about factors of 2 pi and minus signs. I don't know. I think yeah, science is also about community, right?
yeah.
I think
And
that's a really big piece of it.
there's certainly the stereotype of the scientist as a deeply introverted person that
Right.
fundamentally wants to be left alone.
Right.
Um, but experimental science, at least in the fields that we work in, is a collaborative policy.
Right.
It tends to be smaller teams, 2 to 5 people,
Yeah.
right? But these are projects that are almost impossible alone.
Right.
It's too much time, too much work, too many different expertises
Yeah, I think that's
needed.
critical. Is that there's a synergistic effect, right? That
Yeah.
you're sort of stronger as a team than you are individually. I think the only exception to that are like the Einsteins of the world, right? That Einstein, I think, was who he was because of the like a severe amount of isolation. But if
Yeah.
you're brilliant and you like kind of just shut yourself into a patent clerk office and think really, really deeply about a problem, you can sometimes come up with a perspective that's so unique and different from the sort of main thread of how everyone else is thinking that you can have a big impact. Um, but I think a sort of more established thing, certainly for experimental science, you get a bunch of smart people together with different expertise, and you just chat about it, and you just try a bunch of stuff, and that's like what conferences are about. We sort of share ideas. We have sometimes heated conversations, but that's all a means to sort of distilling knowledge that can help all of us. Uh,
Yes.
you know,
And like they really conferences play a vital sort of like mixing or melting pot role.
yeah,
Like you talk to somebody, maybe that's another key theme, right? Is that as you go through your research career, you want to move between communities. Like
right,
you do your undergrad somewhere, your grad, your postdoc, and a lot of this is to sort of avoid getting indoctrinated in exactly one way of thinking and one way of doing things.
right, right.
Um, and
Yeah, totally. And hmm,
and to get PIs whose experience is different, right? Like we both work in superconducting circuits, but
yeah,
I know superconducting circuits and cold atoms and quantum optics, and there's other
right,
people who come to it with like RF engineering, radio astronomy background,
right,
or condensed matter transport physics,
right.
and we work on different questions
Yeah,
at different, and we succeed at different aspects
right.
of
But I
these
think the
problems.
ability to sort of harness the collaborative approach and acknowledge that, some people are experts at things that you don't know well. I think there's a lot of folks that's a very intimidating thing to work with somebody that knows a lot about something you don't know about. And you can either be intimidated to a point where you like don't put yourself in those situations, or I remember distinctly in grad school in the first like year, a lot of people showed up, and I think we're all taking classes, and there was this sense in which, we'd be trying to talk about a problem set or something, and some people would just not engage and sort of be very dismissive, like, oh, that's easy. And a lot of times that was like a defense mechanism where they didn't want to show that they didn't know stuff. This happens with PIs too, for the record. Like sometimes
Or
they
that
don't
they found
they're
it
not aren't
hard. Like,
yeah, they found it hard, and they're there's the type of person that sort of tries to shield, like not let other people see the vulnerability of not knowing something. But I realized very quickly that, well, I want to learn that thing. I don't know it. And I can either pretend like I know it and kind of not engage, or I can just flat out be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Here's what I know, but like, why is this the case? And like, ask a question of somebody who's an expert and like really put yourself out there. And that's the most efficient way to learn something.
yes.
But it takes vulnerability to like kind of get there. And I saw that with a lot of my cohort. And I've never been afraid to sort of tell people it's not the same. I remember you and I were upset with people that were just like, I don't get it. And like if that's it, if you just say I don't understand and then don't
Yeah.
give them any sense of what like where you're at, then that's useless. But I'm always like, hey, this is what I understand, but I don't get why you said this, right? I think that's the key, at least for me. Um, anyway, well, so we've been
Yeah.
at this for a while. This is
I think
very fun though.
like one of the points that you're making is that like the job of a undergrad, grad student, postdoc, or faculty member is to learn stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the most it shutting yourself up in a room by yourself is usually not the most efficient way to learn.
Yeah.
But also being like, I don't know anything, teach me,
Mm-hmm.
is also not the most efficient way to learn. That there's like the right amount of I need to work through this myself and I have questions, talk to me, like striking the right balance.
Right.
Like I certainly have students whose sort of instinct is to hole up for 2 months so that
Yeah.
they can then come back and say, I figured it out. And I try to tell them that, well, that's incredibly inefficient because I'm a resource. And if you did this entire thing without talking to me, it means you didn't make use of any of my
Right.
knowledge.
Right.
Uh,
But on the other hand, they probably learned it in a way that will really stick with them, right? So I think
yeah.
there's this like delicate
But coming back
balancing act.
for questions at the right interval,
Right.
right? We talked, I went away and I thought about it and I got this much further and this is now where I'm confused. And then you can have a really productive feedback loop.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we've covered a lot of it. It's been fun to reminisce. I feel like there's a lot more that we could have gone into with this paper, including how the forklift was needed to
give Andrew nightmares.
some equipment that was very expensive,
Oh,
much
yes.
closer to the top of the fringe to avoid cable loss. And
And just strapped it on there with cable ties. We were crazy.
that was one of the most memorable uh, um
What's
Alicia
another
Riccius
Alicia thing?
hacks. Yeah, I sort of learned a lot of that from you. I carry a lot of that with me now.
I was very proud that my students eventually learned it from me. So we were things were unstable in the fridge and we went ground loop hunting, otherwise known as, unfindable gremlins. And so I came into lab one day and I found the breakout panel for the fridge hanging off of some cable ties with a few tissues and bits of cardboard stuffed behind it and a random 2x4 sitting on top of the fridge. What's going on, guys? And they said they discovered that the panel was shorting to the fridge mount. The still line would come down and touch the fridge, and so they grabbed all of the available like insulating objects in the lab and stuck it in there.
Yeah.
And I believe 4 years later, that panel is still held up with cable ties and the same
Yeah.
tissue paper. It's just like we
Well,
need
that
this to
goes
not
back.
touch.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to this 2 pi minus sign thing, right? Like I think the type of student that starts grad school having done well in undergrad, or you could sort of say this about high school to college transition as well, is like um if you're sort of the type of person that needs to have every little step be perfect, and if you're kind of a perfectionist, then
Yep.
you're not going to be able to do those kind of things, and you'll probably waste a lot of time.
Yeah.
Like in that case, I mean, your students at least did track down the problem, but in some sense, like, I'm not advocating for sort of aggressively not understanding some things, but you're like, if you're pretty convinced that you fixed a thing, ideally you try to figure out why that fix worked. But
Yeah.
sometimes, and this is pretty common, you're like, well, it fixed it. I don't really know why, but I'm fairly certain it's fixed. Like, let's move on to the more interesting thing.
And I think this was also like a special case of like we could have gone, this is causing a short. We need to replace this with a non-metallic version.
Right.
Okay. The only way to do that is to go and order a piece of plastic, drill all the holes, and remove and reinstall all the cables.
Right.
Which is how we've built all the new systems.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But what they did was, what's the fastest way for me to see if it makes a difference?
Right.
Pull out the screws, put some paper behind it.
Which is actually kind of just like a prototyping technique.
Yes. That and there's a lot of point to the quick and dirty version first,
Yeah.
and then see if you need to make a
Yeah.
nicer version.
Yeah.
But you can't do everything sloppy and you can't do everything perfect. You somehow have to balance.
Yeah, and it's the type of thing in research because you're always chasing these other things, and that's always moving. I think one of the challenges is to not let that overwhelm you. Like this happens with code all the time where you're trying to just grad students are just trying to like hack some code together that kind of gets the job done. And then if you if you let too many generations of students do that, then you end up with this Frankenstein code that's held together with like actually the
You won't
code
know it
I
as
inherited.
Matchmaker Pro.
Yeah, exactly. So the code I started with to draw the circuits that are behind Alicia and in the figure in the paper. I remember distinctly it was like several generations of undergrads had written some code and I inherited this mess and there were like variables that were like, it was like so and such is equal to 1,000 third like, you know, just like some random number with many significant digits. And I was like, what the hell is this thing? And so I started deleted it and the whole code fell apart. Like, and I was like, what on earth is this? That's where the stereotype of physicists writing code comes from.
My
uh,
old lab partner would do that. He would like multiply out four physical constants into 2 pi and just write this thing is equal to 5,829.378.
what is that?
What did you do, man?
Oh gosh. Well, anyway, it's been really fun to catch up. Thanks for taking the time. Yeah, and good luck with everything. I'm excited to yeah, chat more down the road. Um guess I'll probably provide a link or something to your website if that's cool. And
Okay.